Hello, this is Dr. Mercola, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kate Rheaume-Bleue, who is a naturopathic physician, and she's the author of Vitamin K2 and the Calcium Paradox, which is a phenomenal book about one of the most important vitamins that we know of, which is vitamin K2. And it's the best book I've read on this highly underappreciated topic. And I'm just delighted to have her here today to share her insights on this really important area. And she comes today from Canada, so thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit of how you first, well, tell us a bit about your training and how you first became interested in vitamin K2.
Well, I'm a naturopathic doctor, which in Canada, the area I'm in is a licensed primary care physician, but of course with a keen interest in nutrition.
Do you have the ability to write prescriptions too? Not that I would suggest that you do that, but because I know in there's about 5 or 6 states in the United States, maybe more, maybe 10, that naturopathic physicians are licensed and have prescription privileges.
In the province of British Columbia, actually, we have prescribing rights, but I'm in Ontario. We don't have that yet, but we still do, order and interpret blood tests, make diagnoses, and can recommend treatments and prescribe treatments, not prescription drugs just yet.
And you went to the Canadian College?
Yeah, Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine. I graduated from there, did my residency at that college, and spent some time on the faculty there.
Yeah, that's a bit of an anomaly because I had a relationship with a woman who went to one of the authentic grad schools. You know, the 5 or 6. Is it 6 in North America?
6, yes, 6. 5 or 6.
Yeah, that actually give the 4-year accredited degree.
Right.
And so I actually spoke at that college in Canada once.
Oh, yeah?
But I would imagine most of the Canadians graduate from that school.
Primarily, and then Boucher Institute in Vancouver is also accredited now. So there's 2.
It's a new one. I didn't realize that. Okay, so how did you transition into your interest about vitamin K2?
I tuned into the emerging research about K2 back in 2007, early in 2007, and not long before I had read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston Price. And when I learned about K2, I thought, hey, you know what, I'm sure Price talked all about this in his book. And so I went to the book and looked through it and didn't find any reference to vitamin K2, and I was really stumped. And a little bit later in 2007, read a brilliant article by Chris Masterjohn that links vitamin K2 to Price's work on Activator X. And once I realized that link, the light bulb went on about how important this nutrient is, how overlooked it's been for so long. It just is such, it really provides the missing piece to the puzzle of so many health conditions, and yet it was being completely overlooked despite the overwhelming amounts of modern day research. And so I figured somebody would be writing a book about it soon, and waited a little while and nobody did, and that's when I realized that I needed to do that because people need to know this information.
Terrific, I'm glad you did. As I mentioned earlier, it's probably the best, well, it is the best book I've ever read, and I haven't exhaustively reviewed the others, but I suspect it is the best book ever written on this really important topic. So can you really describe what vitamin K is for our viewers?
Sure. Vitamin K is actually a group of fat-soluble vitamins, 2 main ones. Most people are familiar with vitamin K1, and when they say vitamin K, they're referring to K1, which is found in green leafy vegetables, very easy to get in the diet.
And this is actually, excuse me for interrupting, but what we really see in the literature or in the newspapers, they hardly ever differentiate between vitamin K1 and K2. They just say vitamin K, no number attached
Exactly,
to it.
And that's created a lot of confusion. It's one of the big reasons why this important nutrient was overlooked, and it still creates confusion when we learn about this nutrient. So K1, found in green leafy vegetables, easy to get in the diet, and it exclusively participates in blood clotting. That's its only role in our health. K2 is very different. It comes from different food sources, and its role in the body is in moving calcium around. So specifically, it will guide calcium into the bones and teeth where we want it to be, and it will get calcium out of, so prevent the deposition and even remove calcium from areas where we don't want it to be, like soft tissues, arteries, for example, where calcium can cause hardening of the arteries. So K2 is really critical for keeping our bones strong and our arteries clear. So those are majorly important health concerns, and K2 is a very important nutrient for those health concerns.
And the other vitamin that we think of with calcium, of course, is vitamin D. So can you comment on the interaction between vitamin D and vitamin K2.
This is another really interesting story because we've heard so much about vitamin D and the importance of vitamin D for our health, and a lot of people are taking vitamin D, and yet D and K2 partner up together. So a lot of the health benefits that you want from vitamin D, really you need to have K2 with it for that to work. So when you take vitamin D, your body creates more of these vitamin K2 dependent proteins, so the proteins that will move the calcium around. So they have a lot of potential health benefits, but until the K2 comes in to activate those proteins, those benefits aren't realized. And so really, by taking vitamin D, you're creating an increased demand for K2, and D and K2 work together to strengthen our bones and improve our heart health.
Yeah, it's really the cement, the important part of the cement that integrates the calcium into the bone matrix.
That's right. You know, for so long we've been told to take, say, calcium for osteoporosis, calcium, more calcium, and vitamin D with that, which we know is helpful. But then more studies are coming out showing that increased calcium intake is causing more heart attacks and strokes, and that created a lot of confusion around whether calcium is safe or not. And really, that's the wrong question to be asking, because we'll never properly understand the health benefits of calcium or vitamin D unless we take into consideration K2, and that's what keeps the calcium in its right place.
Now, it just occurred to me that many people watching this may not really understand what a naturopathic physician is. So maybe if you could just comment on that, and then after you explain that, comment on a naturopathic physician's perspective on the sources of calcium and versus supplement versus food.
Sure. Well, a naturopathic physician, first of all, at least in my jurisdiction, certainly is a primary care physician. So somebody who would be a first point of contact for your health concerns, who can listen to your health history, give you a thorough physical exam, order and interpret blood tests if necessary. And rather than prescribing pharmaceutical medications, although rarely those are indicated and do come in handy, can treat your concerns with dietary changes, nutritional supplements, and other natural treatments that work with the body. And the most important distinguishing factor for a naturopathic physician is that we try to look at the underlying causes of your health concerns rather than just treating symptoms. And so this is where considering calcium, the recommendation for people to take calcium has become very popular. Everybody is taking calcium and vitamin D, and every doctor, and even conventional medical doctors, even if the ones who won't recommend a multivitamin, will tell their patients to take calcium and vitamin D. And yet this has been a bit oversimplified. First of all, studies are showing that calcium from supplements seem to pose a greater risk for hardening of the arteries and heart attack and stroke than calcium from diet. But that being said, we have to keep in mind that heart disease, so heart attacks and stroke, is the #1 killer of both men and women, whether you're taking calcium supplements or not. So we have to understand that calcium can get into the wrong places in all of us. So there certainly are lots of different sources of calcium that we can consider, and that gets into quite a lengthy debate. But the most important concern is, how do we keep calcium in the right place? So not focusing so much on the calcium, but the other nutrients like D and K2 that make calcium safe and effective.
Well, if someone felt, for whatever reason, that they were calcium deficient, what would be your recommendation to them? Would it be to consider a calcium supplement, or to seek to find food sources of calcium?
First, to look at food sources and look at increasing calcium intake through their food sources. And it just so happens that a lot of the very high calcium foods that we would consider, like cheese, for example, are often very high in vitamin K2. And that's important because I think nature has given us these nutrients together so they work optimally. So that is definitely the first course of action. And there are some cases in which calcium supplements are indicated. So for individuals, for example, who may have osteopenia, osteoporosis, some kind of bone loss, who find a hard time maintaining adequate calcium intake just through their diet, then therapeutically calcium supplements do have their place and can be useful, as long as they're taken with the proper balancing nutrients. Magnesium's a big one, and of course D and K2.
Yes. So magnesium seems to be the other stealth nutrient, sort of the appropriate analogy, or relative to vitamin K2 to vitamin D, magnesium would be to calcium. And there's an emerging popularity of it and appreciation, but for the most part, most of the focus seems to be on calcium when it comes to bone health.
Yeah, it has. And that's another area where certainly these calcium and heart health studies had shortcomings because none of them took into account magnesium intake. We know that magnesium deficiency is common. And when you have magnesium deficiency or you're lacking in magnesium and you take calcium, that can exacerbate those problems. And certainly magnesium complements K2 in a number of ways. Magnesium lowers blood pressure, and blood pressure is an important component of heart disease. So really there are a number of ways in which magnesium is also, underappreciated, important part of good health and complements K2.
So dairy foods and vegetables seem to be a reasonably good source of calcium for most people, and other minerals, of course. Potassium would be another key. Which frequently gets confused with vitamin K because they both have the letter K, and K is the chemical signal for potassium.
Yes, I didn't think of that at all before I wrote the book, and then I kept getting that question. But you're right, people ask about potassium because of the chemical symbol K, but they really are
no relationship
very different.
At all. Yeah. So calcium, the dairy and the vegetables being a good source of calcium. What would be good sources of magnesium?
Magnesium's a little more tricky. Sea vegetables are a good one, kelp, dulse, nori, those things, but we know that they're not that common in people's diets. Vegetables can be a good source. Grains and whole grains are typically good sources of magnesium, but they need to be prepared properly because, as you know, whole grains can contain phytates and anti-nutrients that will ultimately block our absorption of magnesium if they're not prepared properly. And so that's a situation where a magnesium supplement for therapeutic purposes can come in very useful for people to get enough magnesium to, say, lower their blood pressure, replenish their stores, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you may not realize, but my first book that I wrote was in no grain diet. So, which I've revised my position. I don't think grain should be avoided by everyone. I think there probably is some good benefit for it, but the majority of people seem to benefit from lowering their amounts of grain.
I agree. And this whole concept of whole grain has gotten far out of control, and then multigrain and the tricky thing with the grain is that it's just not being prepared properly. And so certainly in my book, I say, if you're not going to go through the steps to prepare it properly, you probably shouldn't be eating it at all.
Yeah, I mean, you probably know that in 1960, 10% of the population in the United States was obese, 10%. And the recent projections are 2030, literally 70 years later, it's going to be 50%, 500% increase. And I think a large variable that contributed to that was this increase in the grains and the carbohydrates and the sugars.
Yep, I agree, 100%.
But grains do serve a role, and I believe they are part of, used appropriately and in the right levels, can be part of a very healthy diet. Let's get to, but still, as you just mentioned, magnesium is a very difficult supplement or mineral to acquire. I mean, I think vegetables are useful because of the magnesium seems to be an integral component of chlorophyll. I mean,
yes.
Magnesium ion substitutes for iron. Chlorophyll and hemoglobin are pretty similar.
Right.
So, but I still don't think it's in large concentration. Certainly bioavailable in vegetables, but in chlorophyll. But if one wanted to augment or increase the amount of magnesium therapeutically, because most likely they're in a magnesium deficient state, do you have any recommendations for magnesium supplements?
I've seen good results with fairly simple magnesium citrates even for lowering blood pressure. And, to speak to your point about it being challenging to get, we have to also keep in mind, we like the idea of being able to get all of our nutrients from food, but we're also living under very stressful times, unnaturally stressful times, which really depletes our nutrients far more than we can often recover just through diet. So, a magnesium supplement like magnesium citrate, I've seen good results with those for replenishing magnesium stores.
Okay. Yeah, the downside of taking magnesium as a supplement, it could be an upside for some people, is it tends to have to loosen your stools. It's basically serves as a laxative, and so you have to be careful of that. Whereas calcium has a reverse effect; it's constipating.
Right. Yeah.
Magnesium citrate of all the supplements seems to be one that has much less of an impact on the bowel habits. Are you familiar with magnesium threonate?
I don't have much professional experience with that because it has become more popular since I've been took a leave from my practice for having a baby and writing a book and whatnot. But I know that that's one that you have done more work with, right?
Well, it just seems to be an emerging one that's emerging well, and primarily because of its ability to penetrate cellular membranes and mitochondrial membranes. So it's some really fascinating material and its ability to not only restore magnesium levels, but improve energy levels and actually have some impact on aging. So
yeah, I'm going to definitely check that out for the
research.
next edition of the book.
You've differentiated between vitamin K1 and K2, and I'm wondering if you can give us an idea of what our needs are and what the typical person might be consuming in their diet.
Well, the optimal amounts of vitamin K2 are just being established, and we're still sort of refining that. But it seems like around 180 to 200 micrograms of vitamin K2 should be enough to activate all of our body's K2-dependent proteins to get the calcium where it needs to be and get it out of the places where it shouldn't be. So the most recent clinical trials use around those amounts of K2. And the average person is getting a lot less than that, that's for sure. In the North American diet, you can see as little as maybe 10% of that or less, and certainly not near enough to be able to optimize bone density and improve heart health.
Okay. And it gets even a little trickier because not only is there a difference between vitamin K1 and vitamin K2, which you just mentioned, but then K2 subdivides into a whole variety of other different types, sublevels of K2. So
that's right.
Why don't you address that for a moment?
That's right. It does get a little bit technical, but this is very important for people to understand that there are different types of vitamin K2. So the two big categories of vitamin K2 that you'll find are something called MK4, which is menaquinone 4, which can be found in butter, egg yolks, and animal-based foods. That's a short-chain form of vitamin K2. And then there is a longer-chain forms that we find from fermented foods. So there's a variety of these long-chain forms. The most common one that you'll see is MK7 or menaquinone 7. And this is the one I tend to tell people to look for in supplements, because in a supplement form, the MK4 products that you will find on the shelves are actually synthetic. They are not derived from natural, say, animal source foods. Those are synthetic, which does create some confusion. Whereas the MK7, these long chain natural bacterial derived vitamin K2 is from a fermentation process. And that seems to offer a number of advantages. So the long chain form, the MK7, stays in the body longer. It has a longer half-life, which means you can just take it once a day, very convenient dosing. That's the form that's being used in the most current clinical trials on bone density and heart health. So those, that long chain form is really very useful and practical.
When it's compiled or processed into a supplement, do you know a bit about that process? Is it just specifically extracting the MK7, or are there other forms that are in there too, like MK9, MK11, MK13?
So you are getting primarily MK7 because typically these are being extracted from sources like MK7 is typically extracted from natto bean, and the actual natto product has about 90% MK7 to start with. So really you're getting essentially just MK7. You may have very trace amounts of the other types of menaquinones, the technical term for vitamin K2, whereas cheeses, for example, Gouda, very high in vitamin K2, and Brie, those will have a whole range of different types of vitamin K2.
Well, it's just like vitamin C. You can certainly take the extract of ascorbic acid and take it in high doses in supplement, but the long-standing question has been, is that as useful or valuable as the food extracted source where you have all these other ancillary micronutrients that support the bioflavonoids particularly. Right,
and you can see the same example with vitamin E, the various tocopherols, and a number of nutrients like
tocotrienols, and the alpha gamma delta. So I was thinking that it would be a similar situation here with vitamin K2, that the whole balance in the range, not just extracting divided MK7, would be beneficial because there would probably be some supporting role of all the other versions or forms.
That's likely the case. Certainly the clinical trials are only using an extract typically of just the one form, but as Mother Nature provides us with them in a whole package of all these different ones, they likely work together.
So as you mentioned, the average person is probably only getting 10% of their vitamin K2 requirement, predisposing them. First of all, let's get into that. What does this fact mean? What does that translate to? The fact that people are only taking 10% of what there are recently appreciated understanding of what their optimal needs are.
Right. So this ultimately leaves us at risk for osteoporosis, heart disease, heart attack, and stroke, as well as a number of cancers. So, I talked about vitamin K2 moving calcium around the body. Its other main role is to activate proteins that control cell growth. So that means K2 has a very important role to play in cancer protection. So when we're lacking K2, we're at much greater risk for osteoporosis, heart disease, and cancer. And these are three concerns that used to be relatively rare. And over the last 100 years, as we've changed the way we produce our food and the way we eat, they have become very common. And the lack of K2 is playing a really big role there.
Is there any connection to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there was a lot of research, a fair amount of research on that. And I think that's the area of research around vitamin K2 that has the most potential, or maybe is lacking and more work needs to be done. But neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and even multiple sclerosis and a number of other neurological concerns.
Okay, so it's really important that you pay attention to this nutrient, because there's a bulk of emerging research that's supporting this very strongly, probably every bit as much as vitamin D. But vitamin D, of course, has received much of the attention clinically. And I believe that's partially related to the fact that in the late 90s, there was a commercial assay to test for vitamin D that became available, because for 100 years, we knew it was connected to rickets, and that was about it.
Right.
But as we've developed an inexpensive assay to test for it and became commercially available, then the interest in it sort of exploded. The parallel of that, however, with vitamin K2 specifically, is that there still, to this day, is no assay. It's basically a research tool, which probably explains why there's such a lack of appreciation of this, because there's just not the logistical infrastructure to make it easy to do research on this.
Exactly, and that is, it does speak to the challenge of K2, because a lot of the concerns of K2 are so internal, right? You can't look at somebody and see that they have bone density problems, or they're on the road to
just
heart
like
disease.
Vitamin D.
Exactly, and so much of heart disease goes undetected, even with all our technology, goes undetected until a heart attack strikes. And so that's where we really like to have a test to say, okay, to show I'm absolutely deficient in vitamin K2, and yet the best tests are just not available through clinicians. They really are, as you said, research tools being used in academic settings, and they're not available and out there yet. That being said, research has shown that the majority of adults are in fact deficient in this nutrient. And by deficient, I mean that they don't have enough K2 to keep calcium in its right place at all times, increasing our risk for osteoporosis and heart disease and cancer.
And brain disease.
And brain disease, and a number of other health concerns. I mean, any kind of inappropriate calcification, kidney stones, heel spurs, even small things where calcium shouldn't be. And yet without that test, people remain doubtful. So I know that's coming. It wasn't too long ago that we didn't have the test for vitamin D, and now we do. But in the meantime, we really can't afford to wait until we have that test to start getting the K2 back into our diets.
Terrific. One of the important principles that you alluded to is, I think it's a pretty profound principle in naturopathic medicine, in that most disease progresses to the point, on average, where there's typically 80%, you're 80% of the way there before you have the first symptom. And in some diseases, it's 100%, like a heart attack. You could have a fatal heart attack, have no symptoms at all, and then you're dead. So that is really crucial to understand this process that exists. So I'm wondering if you can comment, or if you've seen in your review of the literature on K2, about the prevalence. You said the majority of people have this, But I know this, I wonder if you can get more specific, because at least the initial research, and may have changed since the attention has been focused on vitamin D, but it was 85% of the people did not have therapeutic levels of vitamin D. And this was even obscured too, because what is a therapeutic level? What is an optimal level? Because most of the initial research prior to the 90s was focusing on, above 20 nanograms per milliliter. I don't know what you use in nanograms or
nanograms.
Because Europe uses a different standard for the index. But now we know it's over 50. Literally 2 to 3 times higher than the original. So I'm wondering if there's a comparable specific statement with respect to the number of people, the specific percentage. Is it just sort of generic majority, or is it more specific than that?
Right now it's generic majority, but looking at the studies, we're seeing an overwhelming majority of people who are deficient in K2. So 80% and plus simply don't have all of their K2 proteins activated. And that is critical, and it's not surprising given the amount of heart disease and osteoporosis, cancer, and diabetes as well that's implicated. Right.
So pretty similar to vitamin D.
Very much so.
Not only, and there's another similarity in that they're both fat-soluble vitamins.
Yes, that's right. And that's an important similarity, because these really are the foundation of our health. They allow us, these fat-soluble vitamins, to make use of all of the other nutrients that we get into our bodies. And that's important. And even, when you talked about the debate on what is an optimal range of vitamin D, and that still continues, how much vitamin D should you be taking? And I do speak about that in the book, because ultimately the answer to that question is, it depends. And it depends to a certain extent on your K2. We see a lot of health benefits of vitamin D where D is healthy and helpful to a certain point, after which point we see harm with it. And where that point is depends a lot on how much K2 you have in your body. So, the more D you take, the greater demand you create in your body for K2, and the greater potential you stand to get from taking K2. So they really do work together in so many ways.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of getting the majority, if not all of your vitamin D from exposing your skin to sunlight. And then secondarily, if that's not available, especially for Canadians and most people in North America, northern North America would be, safe tanning bed, because it's the closest approximation. But clearly that's not going to be available for everyone, so we have to make a concession and swallow oral. But I haven't taken oral vitamin D for years. So this is a really important point. I wonder if you can expand on it, because it's really crucial, and it's something that we don't emphasize enough, and I'd like to start doing that on a really consistent basis, is to warn people the dangers of taking oral vitamin D without the vitamin K2. So I'm wondering if you could give some parameters and guidelines on how to frame it, and what people should be thinking of before they make this decision to swallow oral vitamin D.
That's a really good point, because there are so many people on the vitamin D megadose bandwagon taking more and more of D, and it could absolutely be causing harm if you are lacking the K2 to complete the job to get the calcium where it's supposed to be. We know that we don't see symptoms of D toxicity very often, but when we do, those symptoms are inappropriate calcification. That's a symptom of detoxicity, and that is actually a lack of vitamin K2 that will cause that. K2 protects you against that toxicity, quite simply. And so when we talk about nutrients together, we like to hear about ratios and optimal ratios, and that hasn't been perfectly elucidated, but I would say for every 1,000 international units of vitamin D you're taking, you should look at least 100 micrograms of K2, if not, the 150 to 200 range, something like that, to try to even it up.
It's a pretty large dose, because we work with Carol Baggerly from Grassroots Health, and she's done a study where she's analyzed the level of vitamin D, oral vitamin D supplementation that's required to reach a therapeutic level of about 50 nanograms per milliliter. And she found that was about 8,000 units. So you previously had stated that the typical dose for someone is K2 would be about 150 micrograms, 200 micrograms. So if they were taking 8,000, would they have to take a gram or a milligram? I'm sorry, a milligram of vitamin K2?
800 to.
That's a lot of vitamin K2 as a
is.
supplement.
Yes, that's right. So that was my earlier recommendation was not taking into account people who are doing high dose vitamin D supplementation. So that's where it gets a little bit more technical. It seems that for the average person, 200 micrograms, around 180 to 200 micrograms will activate your K2 proteins and do a lot of good for your bones and your heart. If you're taking high levels of vitamin D, or 8,000 international units, that kind of thing, then I would recommend taking more K2.
Okay, it's really as high as a milligram.
Yeah, as high as a milligram. Again, this is where we need to do a little bit more.
That would be 1,000
testing.
Micrograms. Those can't do the math.
Yeah, that's right. But we need to be doing a little bit more. We need to do a little bit more study on that particular aspect of the ratio between those.
Let's talk about toxicity, because that's the counter side.
Right.
Because a lot of the supplements we recommend, like astaxanthin or ubiquinol, essentially there's no known toxicities of it. Well, ubiquinol for sure, maybe very large doses of astaxanthin. But what is the toxicity of a large dose of vitamin K2?
That's the really good news. K2 has no toxicity. There is no known toxic effects. This is something that we see again and again in the literature. That's surprising for people to hear, because we're used to, with fat-soluble vitamins, there being a potential for toxicity. The reason why K2 doesn't have a potential toxic effect is because all that K2 does is activate K2 proteins. It'll activate all the K2 proteins it finds, and if they're all activated and you take extra K2, it simply won't do that. And so that's why we don't see a potential for toxicity the way we do with A or D. So that's really good news about K2, and why you don't necessarily need to wait for a test, because we know a lot of good health benefits and no downside. So it's a good thing for you to be taking.
Yeah, I spoke to Dr. Vermeer, who was like one of the leading researchers in this, and he was really adamant about that too. No known toxicity at any doses.
Right.
And just getting back to the interconnection with vitamin D, it would seem that the reason for the increased need for vitamin K2 when you're taking high dose of vitamin D is that vitamin D somehow stimulates or activates these vitamin K2 proteins.
Exactly.
And if they don't, and so the protein goes unactivated by vitamin K2. There's more of them. That's why you need more vitamin K2.
Exactly. By taking D, you are essentially creating a greater demand in your body for K2. So if you take D at high doses for a long time and don't have the K2, that's when you're going to start to see problems, or at the very least, you'll be missing out on a lot of the benefits that you want from your D.
Now, this is a really important part, maybe one of the most important parts of the interview, is that because of the fact that there is no vitamin K2 test, so let's create one empirically. How would you, what type of quiz would you give a person to know that if their answer to these questions is no, then the likelihood of them being vitamin K2 deficient is very, very high, considering 85% of the people watching this are K2 deficient. And I'm sure we're both in agreement that the ideal way to get your vitamin K2 is not through a supplement. It's through food.
Yes.
And that's the way we're designed to do it. So why don't you see if you can take a stab at answering that question to give people a tool, a resource, so that they can identify if they're at risk.
Right. Well, there's two ways you can identify this. You can go through a long list of health concerns and symptoms, osteoporosis, heart disease, diabetes, all of these things. If you have any of those concerns, then you are likely K2 deficient, because those are all connected to K2.
By concern, you mean you actually have these conditions.
You have these conditions.
Not just worried about it.
That's right. But for the people who don't have those conditions yet, because those can go silent, progress for many years, it's very simple. Do you eat grass-fed foods? Do your eggs and butter and dairy products come from animals that are grazed on pasture? If not, then you're probably low in vitamin K2. Do you eat certain types of special fermented foods? Natto, it's a fermented Japanese soybean food, is the highest food in vitamin K2, which virtually nobody is eating here in North America, certainly some areas of Japan. And or high amounts of goose liver pate, or brie cheese or Gouda. These sound like unusual foods, but they are the cornerstones of certain European, very heart-healthy European diets.
Okay.
So this has been shown to be, so first of all, the important thing to mention when it comes to cheese, because this becomes an area of confusion, that because cheese is a bacterial-derived form of vitamin K2, it actually doesn't matter if the cheese came from grass-fed milk. That would be nice, but it's not the grass-fed milk that went into the cheese. It's the bacteria making the cheese, which means it doesn't matter if you're importing your brie from France or getting it domestically. Brie cheese, the bacteria that makes brie cheese, will make vitamin K2.
Is that one that's specifically high in K2?
That's one that's specifically high. Brie and Gouda are two cheeses that are quite specifically high, as well as...
And what's the concentration per ounce typically?
So you're looking at about 75 micrograms per ounce, something
so
like
you need
that.
3 ounces.
3 ounces. So that's a fair amount of cheese.
Not insignificant.
Right, that's right. That's a fair amount of cheese. And, you know, as much as you love cheese, it's still hard to eat that much of it. And yet...
And those are the high concentration cheese, because most of the other cheeses are lower, right?
That's right. Most of the other cheeses are lower. Now, the research also did mention a curd cheese, but I'm trying to discern in North America what that means, because there's a number of different types of cheeses that would fall under that category. But it still takes a fair amount of cheese to get this. But the benefits are substantial. So in the population-based studies that show that K2 levels will decrease your risk of heart disease and prostate cancer, it was actually cheese consumption that was the major determinant of that K2 intake. So it was cheese intake that was protecting those individuals from heart disease and prostate cancer.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And my guess is that, and certainly both of us are not fans of pasteurized dairy, but if you were to consume pasteurized dairy, does that affect the K2 levels, or is it immune to pasteurization?
That's a question that keeps coming up and has not been examined. Certainly K2 is affected somewhat by heat. It's not obliterated by heat, but somewhat. But frankly, it just hasn't been studied yet. So we don't know whether pasteurization affects that. Fortunately, since the bacteria for culturing and making cheese are added afterwards, if the milk was pasteurized before, again, with cheese, you're safe. With grass-fed milk, we don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how about some of the common commercially used cheeses like cottage cheese or American cheese?
Right. So cottage cheese could very well fall under the category of this curd cheese that was considered to be very high in vitamin K2, but I didn't mention it in the book because I wanted to make sure I was recommending people eat the right types of cheeses before we say specifically which ones. Cheddar did make the list of having some K2 in there, but you'd have to probably eat about a pound of cheddar a day to get a therapeutic amount there. And those were the big ones that have been tested. There hasn't been extensive testing done.
We know all that fat would increase your risk of heart disease, so we wouldn't recommend that.
Oh, right. Fortunately, the K2 protects from that. So
no, I was just kidding.
Yeah, I know. But this goes back to the whole idea of the French diet.
But Dr. Vermeer wasn't when I interviewed him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said he like warned against eating the cheese for the heart disease.
No.
Yeah, he just, that's the problem with some of this research. They become become so myopic. They just know about their little area of research and they don't see the bigger picture.
Yeah, because the bigger picture is you don't have to be concerned about the fat because of the K2 in there, and not to mention the fact that the whole sat-fat thing has been quite thoroughly debunked in the medical literature. It just hasn't made it into the media. Oh, that's disappointing. So it speaks to the whole idea of healthy European diets, what we used to consider the French paradox, this supposed contradiction between their high intake of saturated fat and creamy rich foods and low intake of low risk of heart disease. Well, it turns out that goose liver pate, brie cheese, butter, and egg yolks are some of the highest foods in vitamin K2 when they're produced properly. So there really was no paradox. The French were simply happily stuffing themselves with this nutrient that would clear out their arteries.
Yeah, there's another interesting observation too in that this French paradox was referred to the regular consumption of alcohol, which has ethanol in it. And it turns out that there is a regular source that we get of methyl alcohol or wood alcohol primarily through processed foods, even healthy foods, like vegetable juice or fruit juice. Any decayed foods, those bacteria, these putrefying bacteria, will convert the methanol that's normally present in food and make it available as methyl alcohol, which is a very pernicious toxic poison that converts very rapidly into formaldehyde once it hits alcohol dehydrogenation. And methyl alcohol just permeates within minutes in just about every place in your body, but specifically in the brain. And it can accelerate diseases like cardiovascular diseases and diabetes and Alzheimer's, autoimmune diseases. So the interesting point here, the reason I mentioned this is that with respect to the French paradox, is that if you have small amounts of alcohol on a regular basis, and it's believed that our intestinal bacteria can produce this, the ethyl alcohol will be preferentially activate the alcohol dehydrogenase, allowing the methyl alcohol to be excreted through the urine or the lungs or the sweat, so it's not toxic. So that may be another reason for the explanation of the French paradox, which is not widely known. And because the typical explanation, of course, is the bioflavonoids in wine,
resveratrol,
polyphenols and resveratrol and stuff. So, but that's another interesting point. But the K2 is, it's probably not one specific issue, but it's this combination, which goes back to one of my earlier comments, was to endorse the RAP principle, which was to replicate ancestral practices. The closer we get to reproducing those lifestyle patterns of what our ancestors did, the closer we're going to be able to optimize our genes and our biochemistry to push us towards health, which we're designed to be, and to stay away from disease.
And basically, if you don't have either grass-fed foods or these certain fermented foods in your diet, then you can pretty much be guaranteed that you are K2 deficient.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for reviewing that. That's a really great way to help identify if you're deficient for this. And I'd like to expand on that, in that we had done some initial research, because there's not really a lot of studies published on this. But fermented vegetables, which is one of my new passions, primarily for the use of supplying all these beneficial bacteria back into our gut. It wasn't previously known until we did this. We just sent out samples of the high quality fermented vegetables with organic vegetables to start with, and in a very specific starter culture, not just the bacteria that are naturally indigenous to the vegetables while they're grown. So we augmented it somewhat, and with that process, we were able to show that in a typical serving of about 2 to 3 ounces of fermented vegetables, and that's a really high amount. Most people starting fermented vegetables should not go that high. Should start like a half a teaspoon. I mean, because they can have it takes a while to build up to that level. But that's a reasonable level, and I have frequently double that. But in that type of dose, you can expect to find 10 trillion bacteria, beneficial bacteria, 10 trillion. I mean, which is enormous. That's the equivalent of one whole bottle of a high-potency probiotic supplement, a whole bottle of 100. But in addition to that, here's what's really exciting, the vitamin K2 we found analyzed. And actually, we did some initially with our initial starter strains, and then we augmented it with special strains that are known to produce increased vitamin K2. We found 500 micrograms of vitamin K2 in the 2 or 3 ounce servings. So well into the beyond what you would need normally, and even into the range where you want to consider taking supplemental vitamin K2 if you're taking supplemental vitamin D.
And I think that that experiment really speaks to the fact that all cultures traditionally would have had fermented foods, and that would have provided them with K2 to keep them healthy. And your point that you're using a special culture, because it really is the bacteria that make the K2, and not every bacteria makes K2. For example, most yogurts have almost no vitamin K2. Certain types of cheeses are very high in K2 and others are not. So it really depends on the specific bacteria. You can't assume that any fermented food will be high in K2, but some fermented foods are very high in K2.
Yes, indeed, and that's a very good point. I'm wondering if you could expand and summarize some of the science behind the benefits or the mechanism for vitamin K2 and its interaction with heart disease, because of the calcium connection that you referenced earlier.
Sure. This is what blew me away about K2 was the amount of research about so many different health concerns that was already out there, and yet people weren't talking about it. It wasn't making it into the media, hadn't been compiled. And heart health is one of those areas. There's multiple levels of scientific evidence for vitamin K2 and heart health. So there's epidemiological studies, population-based studies that show that people who have higher amounts of K2 in their diet have lower levels of heart disease, and it makes a significant difference, and a large significant difference. So there's population-based studies showing K2 intake lowers the risk of heart disease, as well as prostate cancer and death from heart attack. And then there are in vivo studies, so animal-based studies, where they look at animals with calcification in the arteries, administering vitamin K2 and seeing a reduction in that calcification in the arteries of up to 50% reduction in hardening of the arteries in these animal-based studies. And then we have clinical trials. So there's a big one that was just completed and this summer that the results will be published very soon, but they've already shared some of the preliminary results showing excellent effect of vitamin K2 on essentially reversing heart disease.
Excellent. Can you go into some of the science and the proteins that are involved with that?
Sure. So basically we've got, to keep it simple, you can think of two major sets of vitamin K2 dependent proteins in the body that move calcium around. We have osteocalcin. This is a vitamin K2 dependent protein that will take calcium from our diet and guide it into our bones and teeth. And so osteocalcin, when we, for example, take vitamin D, that boosts our production of osteocalcin. The osteocalcin remains inactive and useless until the K2 comes in and activates it. There's another protein whose job is to take calcium out of the places that we don't want it. This is called MGP, or matrix glob protein. And this, again, will circulate in the body, not doing anything until K2 comes in and activates the MGP. It will cause that to go find calcium in arteries, heart valves, all kinds of soft tissues, and remove the calcium from those areas, effectively reducing hardening of the arteries and reducing your risk of heart attack.
So these two key proteins, activated osteocalcin and MGP, are really the key ways through the benefits of vitamin K2 are mediated.
That's right.
And it's been a while since I've looked at the studies, but do the researchers use these two proteins to assay these proteins within the blood work of people to identify if in fact they're K2 deficient?
That's right. Those are essentially the markers, how much of those proteins are activated or not. So when you're looking at this MGP, so the protein that removes calcium from your arteries, you can essentially see how much of it do you have circulating in your bloodstream, and of that circulating of the protein that's there, how much of it is active and actively taking calcium out of your arteries, and how much of it is inactive. And that will tell you if you have enough K2 or how much K2 you have to make that happen.
So calcium always gets a bad rap for hardened arteries and the plaque where it's deposited. And it's this MGP protein, I think, that's believed now to be responsible for removing the calcium from the plaque.
That's right.
And if it's deficient, then you're going to be more likely to set up a condition to where it's deposited.
That's right. And this is so important because for so long when it comes to heart disease, the focus has been on cholesterol, and yet we know of individuals who have absolutely normal cholesterol levels and then have a great big heart attack, possibly fatal heart attack, and that is because whether cholesterol is high or low, what's important is, do you have plaque building up in your arteries, calcification of the arteries? And so I do certainly talk about that in the book, keeping cholesterol in its place and understanding when it's important, when it's not, and when really you need to be concerned about what heart disease is this buildup of plaque, and K2 will activate the protein that will just take that calcium plaque out of there.
Have you seen vitamin K2 being used therapeutically to actually reverse this process?
Oh, definitely.
Maybe you can comment on that.
Certainly, yes. And I even, for example, in chapter 4 of the book, I do include a case that was contributed by a cardiologist who has used vitamin D and K2 together in his practice to remove calcifications. In this particular case, it was a calcification on a heart valve, which typically would be considered to be something that would need surgery to correct, and to be able to restore that to essentially a normal, healthy heart valve. So you can actually remove these calcifications through diet and through therapeutic use of these nutrients.
I had previously belonged to an organization called ACAM, which is the American College for the Advancement of Medicine, and they popularized a treatment called EDTA chelation, where they inject this intravenously or sometimes it can be taken orally. to chelate the calcium out of the plaques for
Mm-hmm.
people with severe coronary artery disease or arterial calcification. And it would seem, it certainly is useful for many people, but it's a relatively expensive and it's certainly a convenient process, and it requires 40, 50 intravenous treatments of an hour or a few hours or so. And it would seem my objection to that strategy, even though I did it for a while, was that it wasn't a strong emphasis on changing the diet and doing these natural therapies,
Right.
which are really treating the foundational cause of the problem.
Right.
If you don't treat the cause, it's going to come right back.
Right.
So this would seem to be at least an adjunctive therapy, if not really an effective alternative.
Yeah,
for
I
many
mean, this
people.
is essentially nutritional chelation, if you will. That sounds incredible, and even to say that there's a vitamin that can remove calcium from your arteries sounds incredible, but that's only because we think of heart disease and we call it the silent killer. It's just going to sneak up on us and it's going to get us, or it's not, and we don't know if it is or if it isn't. But in fact, the body has always had ways to deal with calcium. We've had to deal with calcium since we have evolved, as long as human beings have been alive. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the body does have a system to get it out of where it's not supposed to be. It's just dependent on certain nutrients, and K2 is the big one. And as long as the body has enough of this nutrient, it will keep the arteries clear.
Terrific. Well, thank you for expanding on that mechanism with heart disease. Is it a similar mechanism with some of these other illnesses like cancer or brain disease?
It's a somewhat different mechanism when it comes to cancer. So there's actually a third protein that vitamin K2 activates that controls cell growth and cell proliferation, which is called GAS6, GAS6. And this vitamin K2 dependent protein seems to play an important role in, again, controlling whether cells are differentiating properly or growing out of control, which is what makes it very important in cancer protection. Prostate cancer is a big one. We've seen a lot of research about that. But leukemia, breast, almost any kind of cancer you can imagine, that was really what shocked me, is the amount of research that was there about vitamin K2 and a variety of cancers. And big cancer killers like lung cancer, lung and prostate cancer are the two bigger cancer killers of men. And vitamin K2 plays a very important role in fighting those.
So it really should be an integral strategy for any approach to decrease or even treat cancer. I mean, it's just crazy not to. And has your research the ones you read that differentiate between the effects of K2 to treat the cancer versus preventing it?
Yes. So there's two bodies of research, quite a bit of research on K2 to treat cancer. Leukemia is the big one that keeps coming up. That seems to be the biggest body of evidence, but there are other cancers that were implicated in terms of K2 and treatment. And then for prevention, that's where we see again, the big cancer killers like lung and prostate cancer in terms of K2 and cancer prevention.
Now, sometimes when you're treating a disease, the dose recommendations change because you actually have an aberrated situation. So would that be the case for someone with cancer? Would they need a higher dose instead of the 200 micrograms? Would they need something like 1,000 or 2,000 micrograms?
That's possible. Now, when it comes to cancer, the majority of cancer treatments and clinical trials have used, because it's older research, have used a synthetic form of vitamin K2. So we see the MK4, but 45 milligrams of MK4 is
maybe you could, could you comment on it? Isn't there a different dose? Because
you're right,
the doses we're recommending was MK7.
You're right. No, all this time we've been talking about vitamin K2 doses in micrograms, so 200 micrograms. It's an extremely small amount of this nutrient. That applies to the long forms, the MK7 forms. MK4, because it's a shorter form, it leaves the body more quickly. It actually is required in much higher amounts. We're talking about milligram doses. 45 milligrams is typical. 45 milligrams is 45,000 micrograms. So that is a much higher dose. And usually that needs to be a divided dose 3 times a day because it leaves the body so quickly. So there is a big difference when we're talking about dosage in terms of the MK4 versus the MK7.
So interesting. It sounds to me like since most all initial research was done with this synthetic and by most likely inferior form of supplementation, and it's we don't even know yet the extent of the range of the benefits of the beneficial natural form, the MK7.
We don't. You know, I liken this MK4, MK7, the synthetic to natural, like D2 to D3. Mm-hmm. There was so much initial research on vitamin D2, but as it was a synthetic form, it makes it easier to produce in a laboratory, and so there was so much research focused on it. And over time, we realized that D3, the natural form, is superior. And it will be the same way with vitamin K2. There was a lot of initial research on MK4, the synthetic form, but as time goes on, we realized that the natural MK7 form is just superior, and there will be much more research being done on that.
But does it, from what's your gut feeling, do you think that if someone was suffering with a cancer now, I mean, it's been some subgroups, it's the #1 cause of death is cancer. So it affects a lot of people who are watching this, or someone that they know really well. Would it seem wise to take a higher dose?
Yes.
And what would the dose be?
Yeah,
I mean, because it's not toxic. I mean, you can't. The only thing that's going to be a problem here is really the cost of it. But again, we encourage people to get this naturally through food, not through supplementation.
Yeah, my sense is certainly for people who already have a health concern, something like cancer, you have to consider the body's needs for K2 on a daily basis for your bone and heart health, and then additional K2 to activate the proteins to get the cancer under control. And so you're looking at higher amounts, be that 1,000, 2,000 micrograms. I have had people contact me who have taken 12 times what I recommended in the book, mm-hmm. and actually had phenomenal.
Which is 200 micrograms?
200 micrograms. Actually, in the book, I recommend 120 micrograms, but I've since increased my recommendations to around the 200 microgram mark based on most current research. But I had people who, for whatever reason, misinterpreted that and were taking 12 times that and got phenomenally good results, much better health results than expected. Now, these are just a few cases, but it's promising that higher doses are beneficial.
And what would likely be the mechanism in the cancer? Is there, like in heart, or when you're increasing the amount of vitamin D, you increase these proteins that need to have vitamin K2 activated? Is cancer producing some other type of protein that needs K2 to address it or to suppress it, or how does it? What's the mechanism?
Pretty much, we see cancerous cells producing certainly the one mechanism that we know, and we know that there are probably a few different ones. There is this GAS6 protein, K2 dependent, and when it is activated, it will control cell differentiation as well as suggest or encourage apoptosis. So that's programmed cell death. So essentially, when the K2 is present, these proteins encourage cancer cells to either differentiate into normal healthy cells or just simply die.
And so if the cancer is present already, it's producing more of these GAS6 proteins.
That's right, which is interesting because it suggests that the cancer, we've been looking for cancer treatments, and that the cancer itself contains and is producing the proteins needed to treat it.
We were just reflecting on this the other day at lunch with some of my staff members, and we, I think, are approaching the 40th anniversary of the war on cancer developed by President Nixon. In the 41 years, I believe. It's 71 is when he started it. And we've directed large amounts of resources, both financially and some of the best scientists that we have. Mm-hmm. And it's been nothing but an abysmal failure. Mm-hmm. It has been
big money pit, yeah.
And I mean, overall, the death rates from cancer have not changed. Mm-hmm. They have not changed. Yet we fail to ignore powerful evidence of something basic and simple as vitamin K2, which is almost free.
Well, this may be the problem. It's almost free. It's natural and you can't patent it. And yet this is how human beings would have always fought cancer and heart disease and osteoporosis. Yeah. But not a lot of money to be made in natural substances.
And the other important fat-soluble vitamin that we know that has a profound benefit, at least from epidemiological research, is the vitamin D.
Right.
So we've talked about the connection with calcium and vitamin K2, but is there, with respect to cancer, is there some specific synergy with vitamin D in K2?
That is an area that seems to be lacking in terms of the research, but it certainly is, whenever I see really any beneficial studies on vitamin D, and there are so many of them, now I wonder, to what extent is K2 involved? And that's an area that the synergy between D and K2 with regards to cancer, that needs to be investigated further.
Are there any other health benefits that you can expand on from vitamin K2?
There are so many other health benefits. K2 has been shown to be involved in improving insulin sensitivity, so diabetes, which is another major epidemic. Very important here. Boosting fertility. Primarily for men, we know there's a very specific mechanism by which K2 helps boost fertility. A number of other concerns.
So it might be good for vegetarians who are taking high amounts of soy.
Oh, absolutely.
Or genetically modified foods.
Definitely. That would be a big one. And something that I really hope comes out of the book, if one thing comes out of the book, it would be an understanding of the importance of vitamin K2 for women who are trying to conceive and who are pregnant and growing healthy children. K2 plays a very important role throughout pregnancy for the development of teeth, both primary and adult teeth, the development of proper facial form, healthy facial form, as well as strong bones. And then again, throughout childhood to prevent cavities, and throughout adolescence as the skeleton is growing. So really so important for pregnancy and childhood and young adulthood, this nutrient.
Are the requirements any higher in pregnancy, especially the third trimester?
That hasn't been investigated, but we do know. So we know in the first trimester we need K2 for the development of primary teeth, second trimester for the development of adult teeth and the face, and then we know that in the third trimester women's K2 levels tend to drop. So there's an additional drain on the system there. So really just as important, or perhaps even more important, to make sure women are getting a lot of K2 during that third trimester of pregnancy, and then again, while breastfeeding. And
so especially in light of the fact of virtually no toxicity, would it seem reasonable to recommend double or maybe even triple the amount just to be safe in the third trimester?
Very much so. I just had a baby and I tripled my K2 intake.
Oh, you tripled exactly.
I tripled my K2 intake throughout the pregnancy. Yeah.
Okay, throughout the pregnancy.
Yeah. So
better safe than sorry. But if you're going to only focus on one small section of the third trimester, is most important, because frequently the first trimester, I mean, the requirements aren't going to be much more because you're talking about a baby that's only a few grams.
That's right.
And you may not even be aware of it until 2 months into the, almost out of your first trimester.
That's right. And so this was a combination of increasing K2-rich foods as well as supplements, because during that time you really don't want to take any chances. You want to make sure you're getting that intake every day. And I tripled it really throughout the pregnancy.
Did you have natto?
Huh? I tried very hard to have natto and didn't work out that well.
Yeah, of course it's fermented soy. It's fermented soy. And so that may have some problems with itself, but the fermentation process should eliminate most of that. But it is a challenge.
It's a real challenge.
From the odor and the texture is a big challenge.
That's it.
I did consume it for a while, and it's relatively inexpensive, easy to find in Asian food stores, but in a regular commercial. And
you don't need much. I mean, the studies show people.
What were the concentrations? I mean, was it like a half a teaspoon or something?
Well, a typical serving of natto, as you know, is about an ounce and a half.
Yeah, but you don't need that whole serving.
You don't need that whole serving. That ounce and a half would contain about 400 micrograms to 500 micrograms of vitamin K2.
That's it in a whole ounce? I thought it was no higher than that.
It would be 1,000 micrograms or 1,100 micrograms for 4 ounces, as I recall.
Oh, I didn't realize that. So,
yeah.
Interesting. The fermented vegetables may be higher concentration.
They may be, yeah.
The natto. Oh my gosh, I didn't realize. I thought it was, for some reason, my memory of natto concentration was far more concentrated than I thought it was.
No, it was 1,100 micrograms for, I think that was 4 ounces.
Yeah, so
that was 3 ounces. 1,100 micrograms for 3 ounces. So that works out to about 350 for that little serving.
So it's still probably higher, maybe twice as high. But pretty comparable and a lot more palatable. And probably more beneficial because natto has one specific bacterial strain in there that produces the K2, but the fermented vegetables have a whole wider variety.
That's right. And it's important to mention, again, we're back to certain bacteria will make K2 and others don't. So natto has K2, miso and tempeh, those other fermented soy foods don't have K2. So that's important for people to keep in mind if they are consuming those foods.
Here's an important question, and one that probably is not well researched, but it's my understanding that, as you mentioned, the bacteria produce the vitamin K2. And if we have an optimized gut flora, don't those bacteria in our gut produce vitamin K2?
Not so much for human
they
beings. We, for whatever reason, humans are not efficient converters of K2. We don't make our own. Herbivores, so cows, chickens, pigs, all of those creatures, they do convert grass and green leafy vegetables, the K1 in there, to K2. And so that's why grass-fed animals have higher content of K2 in their diets. Humans do a little bit, but not enough to meet our needs. And
even an optimized gut flora.
Even in an optimized gut flora, it seems that it is not enough to meet our needs. You can't, and then there's been a lot of studies looking at having a high intake of K1 and how this affects your K2 levels, and it's almost impossible, very, very difficult, to get enough K2 just by having a high K1 intake. It's almost impossible to do. And actually, something very interesting I learned is that even our primate ancestors couldn't do this. So, for example, chimpanzees, these creatures, they would have gotten preformed K2 from insects primarily and other food sources, and they also could not make this conversion by just having vegetables. Yeah.
Well, let's just comment back on perhaps the ideal and optimal form, which would be fermented vegetables, and the easiest. Cheeses would also work too, but many people have problems with dairy, and there's some controversy on dairy too.
Right.
But I don't think there's any controversy in fermented vegetables.
No.
I mean, no one's going to disagree this is not a phenomenal superfood. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on the historical patterns of our ancestors with respect to, I mean, refrigeration is a relatively recent innovation.
Yes, and it hasn't been our friend in the health department.
I'm sorry?
And it hasn't been our friend in the health department, refrigeration, because we've forsaken our fermentation processes for the fridge,
absolutely. Right? I thought it was legal. The health department.
Oh no.
Refrigerators. No, but so in the health area, there's no question.
Yeah.
So, I haven't studied this, but it would be my guess that our ancestors, for many generations back, they obviously, if they lived in subtropical environments or tropical environments, they couldn't grow vegetables year-round or foods to consume. So they had to store it in some way. Otherwise, they were going to go for months, perhaps the majority of the year, depending where they lived, without these foods. So how did they preserve those foods so that they were usable? It was obviously fermentation, but how long have they been doing that for?
Well, that probably a very long time, a lot longer than we might think. And this would be, as you said, a traditional way to preserve foods throughout the year. And those foods, in addition to being able to preserve them, the fermentation process would increase the availability of specific key nutrients. And so it's likely that all healthy cultures have had fermented foods that provided them with vitamin K2, for example, to maintain their health. And this is certainly what Weston Price showed it in his work.
Sure.
To have these foods in the diet in addition to grass-fed foods. But these fermented foods would provide a source of these nutrients year-round.
Yeah, this is like, one of the guiding principles I use to evaluate new approaches or therapies or evidence that's published in the research that contradicts what we know to be healthy is to follow the principle of what I call REP, which is to replicate ancestral practices, which is what big part of what naturopathic medicine is all about.
Yeah.
So if we can just reproduce in our life the patterns or the process, the strategies, lifestyles that our ancestors did, more than likely we're going to activate the genes and the biochemistry that's going to push us towards health and away from disease, just spontaneously, because that's what our bodies are designed to be. And this is one of the reasons I'm so fond and passionate about vitamin K2, because it's one of these REP principles that has basically been ignored and underappreciated.
Yeah, I agree. And that's my rule of thumb for evaluating any new study that comes out, especially ones that seem particularly suspicious. I think, well, could people have traditionally done this? Would they have, gotten the benefits of these foods? You hear about unusual supplements that come from very exotic sources that people just wouldn't traditionally have eaten. And that's a great rule of thumb. And K2 certainly does follow that principle.
So maybe we can comment on some of the other fat-soluble vitamins, how they interact with K2, and that would be vitamin A and vitamin E. Yeah,
I do devote a whole chapter in my book to the relationship between vitamin A, D, and K2 in particular, as well as information with vitamin E, because as much as we love to hear about the great super nutrient vitamin K2, it doesn't work alone. No nutrient works alone. And there really is an important relationship between those three nutrients in particular. So, we've heard so much about vitamin D, and it's really the darling of the media industry, and for good reason. Mm-hmm. And yet, on the flip side, we hear, it seems, nothing but bad press about vitamin A. It has been really demonized and vilified quite unrightly. And there is a relationship between A, D, and K2, and you really do need all of these nutrients to work together. And so, essentially, when you take A and D together in the diet, they will upregulate the production of certain K2-dependent proteins, and so you really do need those together to make it work. They also do help move calcium around the body. So D helps us absorb calcium. K2 then takes it and puts it into where it's supposed to be, and takes it out of, when K2 takes calcium out of arteries, for example, vitamin A helps guide the calcium out of the body. So you actually need that whole cycle and that balance of nutrients to make sure the calcium's where it should go.
Are there any general guidelines you could offer with respect to knowing if you're consuming enough vitamin A? And vitamin A is a little simpler than vitamin K2 or K.
Yes.
Because there's no A1 or there's no
That's right.
A2 or AK7.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that makes it very much easier. And this is another nutrient in which our intake has really declined. That the traditional practice having liver once a week, for example, or forcing your kids to eat liver once a week, people don't do that anymore. So the consumption of liver...
Is that the highest concentration source?
Absolutely, the highest concentration source. And that has really declined. And sometimes that's because the sources we can have for liver, we obviously want this to be from a clean source animal, again, out on a pasture. That will be a clean food.
Not exposed to toxic pesticides or herbicides.
Right, or factory farming feedlot, that's not going to be as clean an organ, because that's a major organ of detoxification. But our consumption of liver has gone down, and cod liver oil. Those two foods used to be just a regular part of the diet, whether you liked it or not. You had those, and they provided vitamin A on a regular basis. And we just don't have those anymore. And I do speak to the fact that you can't rely on vegetable sources, beta-carotene, for example, to provide your vitamin A. There's a lot of problems with the conversion, and you can't guarantee...
Would that conversion challenge be present in most of the population because they're not healthy, or if you're a healthy person, that conversion is an issue and you can get most of your the significant portion of your vitamin A from plant sources if you're healthy?
If you are very healthy, even then studies have shown that individuals who are looking to get optimal vitamin A levels from just eating beta-carotene may be lacking. A portion of up to 50% of those individuals may just not be getting enough of the vitamin A that they need.
It's an interesting point. I'd just like to expand on it for a moment, because there's frequent confusion, just like in the vitamin K world that we talked about, between vitamin A and beta-carotene. And I see it almost regularly in the media where the mistake is made. And even on, I think it's legal to do this on labeling.
It is.
That if a plant food has beta-carotene, they classify it as vitamin A.
Yes.
They make the assumption that conversion is already taking place when that's not true.
Carrots.
Yeah,
Carrots are listed as having 100% of your daily intake of vitamin A, and carrots don't contain any vitamin A.
None, zero.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about vitamin A, we're not talking about beta-carotene. We are talking about preformed retinol.
Yes. Yeah, preformed retinol, because that is the only way you can guarantee you are getting the vitamin A that you need to activate your DNA to produce the proteins to have all the other health benefits that you want. And so we would find this in sources like cod liver oil or liver. These are traditional foods that contain high levels of vitamin A.
Now, large numbers of people watching this are not going to be too interested in doing that.
Right.
Especially if you're vegetarian, but that's a kind of a warning. If you've chosen for whatever reason to remove all animal foods from your product, and really that would be a vegan, you're at risk for this, developing this vitamin A deficiency. And you may be confused thinking that you're not, because you're getting all this beta-carotene. You're getting loads of beta-carotene, because that's what the plant kingdom is notorious for, or really noted for, is the high levels of beta-carotene. And it's very helpful. Natural beta-carotene is phenomenally helpful. We should all have it. This is not saying that we shouldn't eat vegetables, but it really stresses the importance of these animal foods, which is really the only way you're going to get preformed retinol. So if a person isn't too fond of cod liver oil or liver, healthy liver from a pastured organic animal, what are the other sources?
Well, if you...
Like, would butter be one, or eggs?
Butter can be one. Eggs certainly would have vitamin A, some vitamin A in them, and butter, not really high amounts. It would be a real challenge if you weren't eating those foods to eat enough of the other foods. And certainly, again, this wouldn't apply to vegans, but to eat enough of the other foods to get vitamin A levels. And
what type of doses or levels of vitamin A would you need? Is it 10,000 units a day? And how much butter would you have to
right.
to meet that level?
To a certain extent, that depends on how much, how your butter is produced. And I can't recall off the top of my head the vitamin A content of butter because it wasn't high enough to really make it to the list of high vitamin A foods.
So it's not
in
even
my
not
book.
one of the top ones.
It's not one of the top ones.
What are the top 10?
Yeah. Cod liver oil, various types of liver. Those are really the high ones.
That's it.
That's really it.
So
yeah.
we didn't get another answer. It's just that
That's
cod liver oil,
pretty
vitamin
much
D.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if those aren't appealing to you, then it may make sense to do a supplemental form.
And then, actually, fortified dairy products. So these are vitamin A fortified.
But that's still a supplement.
It is still essentially a supplement.
That's a
There's
supplement.
no difference.
So you're just taking your supplement. It's like taking chocolate milk.
Pretty much. Yeah.
You know, it's just,
yeah. So that's really the only other one that made the list.
So if someone wanted to supplement with retinol, what would the dose be?
And this gets us back to what is an optimal ratio between all these nutrients. And I think that you're looking at approximately an equal ratio of A to D. And then...
So 8,000 units or something.
Yes, yeah. So
which isn't very much because you don't need those high doses.
It's not
maybe you can comment too, especially since you just finished a pregnancy, on the toxicity between vitamin A and pregnancy, or the toxic effects. Because normally, at least for many years, it was warned that pregnant women should never be on vitamin A because of the dangers there. And if you could expand, it has to do with some studies that were done, I believe, with beta carotene.
That's right. And the toxicity and concerns around vitamin A toxicity have been very much overblown. And actually, the big concerns around toxicity for vitamin A in pregnancy in particular did not pertain to natural vitamin A. We've not actually seen toxicity with natural vitamin A in pregnancy in either supplements or foods ever. This came out through the studies on Accutane, which is a synthetic form of isomer of vitamin A, which was highly toxic to pregnant women. Yeah. And based on that...
It's one of the few drugs, maybe one of the only ones that I know of, but probably there's a few others, that has this category X.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is, I don't think you can prescribe it unless a woman actually has a pregnancy test. And
that's right. That's right.
Proven to not be pregnant.
That's right. And on the blister pack of the medication, every area where you pop out the blister has a picture of a pregnant woman with a lion and a symbol. Like they're not taking any risks. It was so toxic. But based on that, they essentially discounted any kind of vitamin A for all pregnant women, which was really very much overdone. Vitamin A toxicity has never been seen in pregnant women with supplementation or foods. And yet now pregnant women are actually being told to avoid vitamin A altogether just based on those studies for Accutane. So that really is quite detrimental. It is absolutely possible to have a subclinical lack of vitamin A, which can ultimately affect organ development that can have lifelong health consequences. So you're at a greater risk for a lack of vitamin A in pregnancy than you are for vitamin A toxicity.
Now, if you're taking larger amounts of vitamin E or D, D, you very clearly mentioned that we should increase our dose of vitamin K2 and vitamin A, at least to therapeutic levels. Would there be a similar recommendation for vitamin E because it's a oil-soluble vitamin? Does there seem to be a connection there?
Not so much. Vitamin E, of the fat-soluble vitamins, it's quite different from the other fat-soluble vitamins. It's primarily found in plant-based foods versus animal-based foods. That's different. Although we do find vitamin E in animal-based foods. We can, again, grass-fed animal-based foods will have much higher levels of vitamin E. But it's probably, I call it the wild card because it's the fat-soluble vitamin about which we know the least. And it has some antioxidant effects, but it also may seem to affect the hypothalamus, pituitary, HPA axis for fertility. But really, there's a lot more that we need to know about vitamin E. It doesn't seem to participate directly with the A, D, and K, triangle there.
Now, my understanding is I looked at this area before too, not with respect to vitamin D, but just vitamin E supplementation therapeutically, is that the vast majority, over 95% of the supplements are just wrong because they're using simply one specific isomer, the D-alpha tocopherol. And that's it.
Yes.
At a high dose, 400 units,
right.
or higher,
right.
1,000 units, 2,000 units,
yeah.
which is just bizarre and counterproductive.
And it's not the form of vitamin E you would get from foods at all.
No. Yeah. So, and it may even be the racemic version that they're using, not even D-alpha. There might be the racemic alpha tocopherol. So, my review of this suggests that you may only need 50 units, but you have to have the gamma alpha and gamma alpha delta tocopherols and the tocotrienols, which may be even more important. So it's that whole balance of the nutrients that when we talk about vitamin E, that we're talking about not just D-alpha tocopherol.
That's right.
So important distinction. So is there anything other comments or points that we didn't review or address that you'd like to focus on?
Well, maybe something that we didn't address directly, but certainly indirectly, that really is so important. I think that readers of my book will learn that the story of vitamin K is about so much more than just a nutrient or even just nutrition. It really encompasses what we have lost to the industrialization of our food and what we stand to gain by getting back to the old-fashioned ways of farming and eating.
Very important principle, because not only will you get vitamin K2, but you'll avoid all the other garbage that's putting into processed foods and obtain the other valuable elements of nutrition that are being removed, which is just really, I've studied health and medicine for many decades now, and the more you study it, the simpler it becomes. It really boils down to a few basic principles if you want to stay healthy. And people are regularly commenting and asking questions on our site about how do you treat this really exotic or unusual, bizarre condition. And it always comes down to the basics. You've got to do the basics first. Yes, there's going to be some important fine tweaks and customizations, but you've got to do the basics. And the basics are just what we discussed. And vitamin K2 is a really recently appreciated important part of those basics. It should be the foundation.
It is. It really is one of the foundations for health, and as important as vitamin D, and yet it was overlooked for so long.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the fact that we can't always wait for science to identify these nutrients and test for them before we go ahead and
as someone who studied it really carefully and obviously very passionate about it, read the definitive book on the topic, my take-home summary for this and recommendation is to continue to reinforce what I've been recommending for over a year now, which is to increase your fermented vegetables to 2-3 ounces a day, making sure they're fermented with a strain that's going to produce high quality vitamin K2. And not only are you going to get your K2 for free, but you will get your, maybe even more importantly, because the integration of the beneficial bacteria into our health and all the micronutrients they produce and the interactions and the symbiosis and the synergies are profound. We don't even know the tip of the iceberg, is my understanding.
Right. Yeah, no doubt.
My guess on this.
Yeah, no doubt there are cofactors involved there that improve the bioavailability and everything.
So I want to thank you very much for your interest in writing this book and helping us understand about this really important topic that most people are really relatively clueless about, largely as a result of the lack of research, which goes back to the fact that we don't have this simple test. So if you're not eating these fermented vegetables or this natto, then you better start doing it soon. But if you still don't want to do it, then you have to seriously consider getting a vitamin K2 supplement, and the better ones would be the natural version, which would be MK7, not MK4.
That's right.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.